Good evening, good evening, good evening. That's your cue to pipe down, Father. Well, they will turn it on. Good evening, Eid Mubarak, and welcome to this 4th edition of Museum Talks at the Munch Museum in Oslo. My name is Tominga O'Donnell, and I am Senior Curator of Contemporary Art here at Munch, and have had the pleasure of organizing these talks together with a number of colleagues here at the museum, including Live, Innovation and Research, and not least our director, Tone Hansen, whose idea this was in the first place. In addition, I have benefited from a number of local interlocutors outside the museum. These include Podium, Oslo Kunstforening, UKS, Kunstnernes Hus, Fotogalleriet, Kunsthall Oslo, the Norwegian Association of Curators, and OCCA, the Office of Contemporary Art Norway. OCCA are also co-sponsors of this event as part of the International Visitor Programme they have devised for Laura Raicovich, which was facilitated by Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, the Maretta Jakeri Foundation in Lofoten, and includes a talk at Stavanger Kunstmuseum, so our guest is swiftly becoming well-traveled in Norway. Laura Raicovich comes to us from New York, where she works as a writer and curator and co-owner of the Francis Kite Club, which had me hooked with its emphasis on natural wine from South America. But the bar also operates as a cultural forum and is, and I quote, collectively built space created for sociality, leisure, collaboration, debate, conversation, and play. None of Laura's impressive CV is going to sound as fun as this latest project, but it should nonetheless be mentioned that she has been director of the Queen's Museum in New York, interim director of the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art, which is a museum dedicated to queer art and artists, which is also close to my heart, but not as close as natural wine. She has been the director of the Creative Time Summit, which is an annual conference on art and social justice, and deputy director of the Dia Art Foundation, amongst many other things. She has written widely and had a curatorial fellowship at the online art magazine Hyperallergic, aimed at demystifying curatorial work for a broader readership. So that bodes well for our conversation this evening. It's an especially prescient moment to invite someone like Laura to the museum, since the central tenet of her book, Culture Strike, Art and Museums in an Age of Protest, is that art institutions, museums in particular, are not neutral. This book was published in 2021, so before a number of events that rocked the world, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and perhaps more broadly divisive in the art world, the 7th of October terror attacks in Israel and ensuing mass killings of civilians in Gaza. And the streets last weekend here in Oslo were full of people protesting and demanding a ceasefire. So this is something which is at the forefront of many people's minds, both inside and outside the museum. The false, in my opinion, notion of the neutrality of the museum is not the primary topic of the conversation here this evening, which is rather how museums negotiate their own expertise vis-à-vis that of its publics, and how can art institutions operate as a forum of exchange rather than as a broadcaster of knowledges. But I think you'll agree that our socio-political context provides the backdrop for any conversation of the museum as a forum of exchange. The conversation tonight is between Laura Raicovich and Tone Hansen. Tone has been director here at Munch since October 2022, and before that she was a curator and then the director of Henny Onsdag Art Center. She trained as an artist originally, and I must say, from my perspective, I've been impressed and reassured by her commitment to artistic freedom. which is also something which has come under even greater pressure recently through external cancellations and perhaps the more insidious form of self-censorship, even in places we might have considered to have an open and liberal public sphere. We're sticking with the format we've established in the first 3 talks, which is an introductory framing by our guest for 15 minutes, then a conversation between Laura and Tone for about 20 minutes, and then a Q&A with all of you, which I will moderate, and I encourage you all to participate. We will end on the hour, and you're all welcome to continue the conversation in the bar here at MUNCH on the 13th floor. This is a format that might change in the future. So if you have any input on how this event might improve, please communicate them to us, either in writing or informally, as some of you have done already. Thank you very much. Complaint is a form of care, and that's how your feedback will be interpreted. Okay, Laura only has 15 minutes, so I won't take up any more of her time. But please join me in welcoming Laura Raicovich.
Thank you so much, Tominga. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And I just wanted to thank my hosts on this amazing trip to Norway, which include Tone and Tominga, and also Ruben Steinum and Aurora Aspen from OCA, and Annika Wistrom from the Marta Jakuri Foundation, as well as Hanne Uland from the Stavanger Museum, where I will be going after my 2-week sojourn at the foundation, at the Marta Jakuri Foundation. And I thought what I would do is kind of give you a little bit of a sense of why I wrote this book, which is very related to this idea of broadcast versus exchange in relationship to the museum, and also what I learned from it, because I think at this point I finished writing I finished writing the book a while ago, and so I thought, let me give you a little bit of a context. So I often call myself a recovering museum director because I worked within institutions for most of my career, and I have really enjoyed deinstitutionalizing myself, in part because of the constraints that I see as both very productive but also challenging within kind of the cultural sphere. And so I wrote this book in part because I recognize that museums are not neutral spaces, that they come with a whole set of assumptions that come out of the dominant culture that exists in society. And whether we're talking about what's happening hyper-locally here in Norway or in Oslo or in this neighborhood or on this peninsula that we're sitting on, or whether we're talking about what's happening where I live on Lenape lands that I'm fortunate to raise a family on, and acknowledge with gratitude the many generations of Lenape peoples who have stewarded that land over time. Whatever landscape we're talking about, we are all laboring under the same conditions that the dominant culture produces across the globe. What late capitalism has to deliver, what climate crisis has delivered to our doorsteps. And so, there are things that we can each do that might, knowledges that we can share, experiences that we might have that are fundamentally different because of where we are, but also that have potential for common exchange and an actual inspiration, points of inspiration. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I believe in culture as a space of important work, because without culture, we cannot generate the imagination to imagine the way out of the crises that we face as humanity, out of the crisis of our own potential extinction. And so without our imaginations, without culture to inspire us to think outside of these restrictions, where can we possibly go? Where would we be? And I'll talk just briefly about my personal experiences and why I left the Queen's Museum, because that plays a big role in why I wrote this book. And they were related to a number of political changes in the United States that began long before Donald Trump was elected, but had a very specific high point when he was in 2016, which was at a moment where I was leading the Queen's Museum, an institution that is located within one of the very most diverse places on the planet, and certainly a place where many people come through to visit New York City. New York City's two airports are located in Queens, and so literally some people just come to Queens and never leave because they settle in the areas surrounding the airports. And this is an important factor because the museum itself had always been very dedicated to those immigrant communities. And long before my time. But I felt, especially in the wake of the election of Donald Trump, when 20% of my staff were technically part of the DACA program, the documentation program that President Obama signed into an executive order that allowed the children of people who came to the United States without documentation to actually have some, even if temporary, documents, identity documents. And this is really important to mention because there was a material impact to the threat Donald Trump had and his administration and rhetoric had on the museum itself, on its management. It wasn't an abstraction. It was a real material impact. And so many of the decisions that I made in the coming months were directly related to that impact, including the fact that we really wanted to make it clear to our longtime collaborators and partners in the neighborhood surrounding the museum that we were committed to being a space that was open to migrants and immigrants, no matter their legal status, and that this was an important value that we would continue to uphold no matter what the federal government might say about it. And that ICE, the federal agency that was, threatened to deport anyone who didn't have documentation at the time, that they didn't actually have jurisdiction over our space necessarily. And so we were not required to allow ICE into the building, et cetera. And we would not, we wanted to be very clear about these things. So just to say, the thing that really pushed me to the edge was not only resistance to some of my desires to support immigrant communities, but then a proposal that came from the Israeli mission to the UN to hold an event at the Queen's Museum that marked a major anniversary of the vote that the UN held in 1947 that paved the way for the creation of the State of Israel. And the reason they wanted to have it at the Queen's Museum is because that building that the Queen's Museum is in was built for the 1939 World's Fair, and after the Second World War was actually used as the physical gathering place of the first iterations of the UN, and some very important early decisions that the UN made happened in the building, including some of these historic events related to Israel-Palestine. And I really objected to the idea of hosting this event, in part because the UN itself would never say yes to hosting such an event because of the problematic politics that it represented. And the second reason was because 6 months before the event was scheduled, I was told that Vice President Mike Pence would be the keynote speaker. And my reasoning was that if Mike Pence could say that in 6 months he would be at this event in New York at the Queen's Museum, that there was something going on that was much bigger than whatever the event was supposed to be about, and that there was something happening between Donald Trump and his administration and Netanyahu. And I did not want any part of that. I didn't want the museum to have any part of that. And I just thought this was something that, why should we be involved as a Queen's Museum? Why should we be involved as a backdrop, no matter what the history of the building was, for some kind of political move? In any case, it was a very tricky situation. My board was not entirely convinced that we shouldn't host the event. Normally we would rent the museum for weddings. This was obviously not, or corporate events or whatever, to make some extra income. This was obviously not one of these moments. And so while initially the board decided that we should not move forward with the rental of the space to the Israeli mission, it became very clear that the mission was going to pull out all the stops to make me a target of their wrath at being told that they couldn't do it. I labeled as an anti-Semite. I was written about in the Jerusalem Post, which then transferred to New York papers. Then I became the target of both death threats on social media, of people, saying that they would, find out what school my child went to and kidnap him and do all kinds of horrible things to my family. And I was also then sort of pursued by the local politicians in city council and at the state level to say that I obviously should be removed because of my clear anti-Semitism, and for basically not wanting to endorse an event that Mike Pence was going to be a keynote speaker at, that celebrated an event that had nothing to do with the functioning of the Queen's Museum, and that unified two administrations, both in the Trump administration and the Netanyahu administration, both of which I had, serious problems with. So, this was obviously not 2024. This was 2017 or 2018. I'm sorry, I can't even remember anymore what the exact date was, but it became a very difficult situation. The board then went back on its original decision, said that the event could happen. The event happened. At the event, Mike Pence announced that the U.S. was changing its policy and moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which sparked international outrage and sanctions by the UN, et cetera, et cetera. There were massive protests all over the world. In any case, I was really obviously quite upset that this has all happened inside the museum, but at that point there was nothing to be done. And a few months later, I just decided I could not, under these circumstances, continue my work there in a way that made sense. I decided to write this book because it was clear to me that neutrality was, that there was an idea that the museum could actually stay neutral in such a situation. And as is obvious to anyone to whom I tell the story, that there is no way that one can be neutral in a situation like this. And in point of fact, museums and cultural spaces have never been neutral. They've reflected, in many senses, the ideas and the values and the identities of the dominant cultures that exist at any given moment. And so one of the things that I really wanted to explore in the book was how cultural space had come to this point, and also how we might learn from that and how we might understand a cultural experience in a slightly different way. And this is where I come to the kind of theme that I wanted to get to tonight, which is about the way that cultural space has largely been identified as educational. And that has mostly meant educational in terms of sharing information in a very didactic way, where life and art become highly separated, and our experience of culture becomes one of walking through a set of doors which have a certain very specific set of protocols that are ingrained in some of us who have visited museums during our lives, but for others, this is an abstraction, right? It's like, what do you do at the front desk? What are you supposed to wear when you go to a museum? How much do you pay? If it's pay what you wish, what does that even mean? There are all these kinds of things you sort of have to know. And until you think about what if you didn't know them, you don't realize what a barrier that might be. And then once you step inside the museum, it becomes this question of like, oh, I don't know, there are all these experts, there's expertise within the museum that's going to teach me about how to interact with these works. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's very much a broadcasting form of communication where, the expertise within the museum communicates with people, with audiences, with publics on a basis of sharing expertise, making it accessible to a public. And one of the things that I learned from writing this book and learned from many experiences inside the museum, particularly at the Queen's Museum, where we often had an audience that was perhaps I would say a non-traditional museum audience, in the sense that they were not necessarily going to a million other museums, that the Queen's Museum may be the only or the first or sometimes the only museum that people attended who were visiting us. And, I learned a lot about how to engage perhaps on a different register, one of exchange, of honoring the knowledge, the embodied knowledge of a person who comes into a museum in the same way that one might honor the knowledge of an expert. And so one of the big things that I've asked myself over time, and this came to light particularly at the museum in relationship to translation work, because, of course, being in such a linguistically diverse place like Queens, where there are over 65 or 165, some enormous number of languages and dialects spoken, some of which are no longer spoken anywhere else in the world, because Queens apparently is the place that nearly extinct languages go to die. And there's actually a lot of interesting mapping exercises around this subject. But that this was a place where language, literal language, was a barrier. And many people, one of the things I learned at the museum was also that many people learn Spanish who are migrating from Latin America, for example, from countries that are thought by many people to be Spanish-speaking, many indigenous people and many people who don't speak classical Spanish would learn Spanish and could get by in Spanish in New York. So they had already learned one language to get into that space. So I asked myself, what registers of communication should we be talking in? How do we, as an institution, actually encourage a mode of exchange rather than simply saying, here, this is what I know. I wrote this book, here we go. Or I made this exhibition, this is what I know, I studied this. But actually, how do we open that conversation to an exchange mode of discussion where you become a participant rather than simply being an audience? And I think one of the things that's so interesting about talking about this in this format is that here you all are sitting in chairs in the dark, and I'm here in the light on the stage. And so maybe this is the moment for me to kind of wrap up and invite Tone up so that we can have a conversation that also then involves all of you, because this frontal kind of thing is exactly what I'm talking about, being sort of part of the problematics of you being trained to receive some form of knowledge from me, as opposed to us coming together and having a conversation. So I'll leave it there. Oh, here, let's just put this here.
Thank you for inviting me up on stage.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me to Norway.
It's a pleasure having you here. And to sit here with you today. And I'm sure we're going to make time for the audience to respond also, so that it's not only a two-way or one-way channeled information, stream of information. Although I must say that sometimes a good lecture is very interesting.
We all kind of need that every now and then.
Yeah. So I had a chance to and the opportunity to read some of the chapters of your book, and it's very impressive in the way it's dealing with a bit of a trauma that has taken place before COVID, under COVID, and certainly after COVID. And you also being a person that has been involved in the midst of the storm.
Yeah.
And coming out of it with this book, I think it's interesting. It's a book that is really looking into a situation at that exact moment, and gives us also an analysis of the crisis and the debates that happened, especially in the US around 18 to 21.
Yeah.
And we might return to some of the examples, because sometimes examples are good. They help us in finding a way.
Yeah, they become more concrete, you know?
They do, yes. So, but I was thinking about this, although Tominga said that we're not going to talk about the museum as a neutral space. I really would like to talk about it a little bit anyway. Because I'm wondering about what has, in the recent years, happened to the museum also in scale. And I wonder if scale has also kind of challenged this and maybe reinforced this question of neutrality, of being a neutral space, as it's become part of a dominant culture.
Yeah.
Well, at least in Norway, you would say that museum culture would be a smaller part of the culture. Now we are a dominant part, and we're still having this kind of neutrality idea with us, whether we like it or not. We're constantly thinking about it. So what do we do?
Yeah,
with that?
What do we do with that? It's a good question. So, I think at the core of your question is sort of what our assumptions are about what cultural space does and what art does, like what the function of culture and art is. And, I've spent my career in art in part because I really believe that, cultural space mirrors society in so many very specific ways that if we can figure out ways to make change within these cultural spaces, we might actually see our way to making the larger changes that society requires, I think, to be more just places for more people. And so, the fact that the biases of the dominant society are so obviously visible, once we become attuned to them, because I think if we're part of that dominant culture, it's much more difficult for us to see where those problems lie. And in that case, I think maybe some of the examples that I talk about in the book are kind of relevant. But just to say that, I think becoming aware of the places in which those assumptions about how cultural space functions can be quite alienating, whether it's from what you do at the front desk, how you behave in a museum, what are the protocols, what is the language that's spoken, what languages might the translation of the text be in on the wall, what kind of language is used. This is something that we struggled with at the Queen's Museum many times because, on one level, of course, we wanted for the artists that we were working with, we wanted to be able to communicate and to speak in a language that would support their work within a kind of curatorial art discourse. But at the same time, writing those texts in plain language was very important in order to just communicate with the people who were coming to the museum, never mind the fact that English was not the first language of like 85% of the people who walked through our doors. So, it wasn't just a question of the literal language, but also of the language of the of the kind of coded language that we can sometimes speak in as members of a field, of the art field. So I think that paying attention to these sort of, I call them like the dumb things, is often times where we can begin to see the biggest pitfalls that we fall into.
So I was just thinking about the museum could also be, it's both revolutionary but it's also colonial. It brings with it, even within a museum like this, which is a single artist museum and a museum for modern and contemporary art, we bring with us the history of what a museum do and how it operates. But I'm a little bit curious about the possibility of changing something.
Yeah,
as you're talking about now, and how can we kind of create that platform and make that possibility happen? Because it's not obvious either.
Yeah.
If the space is operates on an exclusive basis, how do we kind of level that?
Yeah, and I think again that this comes back to these kind of asking kind of very basic questions about not only what we do, but how we do it. And so it's about sort of tending to the things that seem perhaps meaningless. And I'm going to give you like a really dumb example, because I like dumb things sometimes are very useful. So when I was at the Queen's Museum, we had a position open for the director of education. And I had approved the job description as director. This is something, we're supposed to do. And the job description went out, and we had this wonderful candidate who was just incredible. And we offered her the job, and she said no because the pay was not what she had anticipated. And I was just outraged because I was like, we wasted all of her time, all of our time, kind of getting into this conversation when there was no way she would have been able to work for the pay that we were offering. And I was like, I'm sorry, but like, did we not have a pay scale on the job description? And my head of HR said, no, we never do that. And I was like, what do you mean we never do that? That's insane. Like, why would we all waste this time? And it's just a complete and utter disaster that we couldn't hire this wonderful person now that we've met her because of this kind of misunderstanding about what the pay scale was. And, you know, so I said, okay, from now on, we have our pay scale on every, and she was like, well, that's just not done. And I was like, well, now it is done. You know, so taking something as sort of straightforward as a, you know, HR policy that seems to have no bearing on reality until it actually does, you know, and I think also, by the way, it's a question of equity, of not making an assumption that somebody would come to the museum to work for any amount of money just because they got the opportunity to be the education director. You know,
We do.
yeah.
Just kidding.
But this is, you know, these are the things. It's like the ways in which we operate have to reflect the values that we claim. And I think that's always a good starting point. And often tackling these things that seem sort of insignificant, but turn out to be super significant for a certain segment of population that doesn't necessarily identify with the dominant culture, that sees whatever that thing is as like a huge barrier to entry.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think in returning to this idea of the neutral zone, I'm curious also about if the museum is actually able to present itself as a place where many meanings, many ideas can take place. Then that kind of neutrality would maybe be a positive asset.
I'm not sure it's ever really neutral, though, because it's coming from a place and a set of decisions that are made, right? So, okay, so, you know, just as another example to just kind of
Go ahead. Arrest me.
kind of, you know, push that a little bit. So, you know, oftentimes in the United States, in any case, and maybe this is true here as well, like an artist will produce a project. Say we're talking about a contemporary artwork that, you know, comes to the MUNCH Museum. And, you know, in the United States, if I were still the president and director of the Queen's Museum, you know, say, for example, I had a board member that didn't particularly like the work. You know, they thought its content was a bit, you know, not really jiving with their politics or their ideas about the world. They might say to me, oh, Laura, what's the deal with that artwork? Like, why are we having this artist in the museum? Like, what is that? What's happening there? You know, I think that a lot of museum directors often hide behind the kind of freedom of speech idea that, of course, the museum needs to be a space where artists can say what they wish, you know, and we have to uphold that as a democracy and as a free society and as a part of civil society. As the museum, we need to uphold that freedom of speech for the artist. But my contention is like if somebody says that, if that's the excuse that's given, that's not really the whole story, because the reality is that the museum has decided to give this person a platform, and so really should own that and say to the person, well, this is an important artist to bring here, and this is an important viewpoint to have featured at the museum for X, Y, or Z reason, and to have that conversation with, in the US perspective, a donor or a board member who's given potentially a great deal of money to support the museum, and to be willing to have that conversation in clear terms rather than writing it off as an issue of freedom of speech, where, yes, it might be an issue of freedom of speech, but it also is a decision by the museum to say, we're going to put our human resources and our staff, physical resources, financial resources behind this work because we think it's important for X, Y, and Z reasons to know why that might be real. And so in this sense, you know, it's not neutral. It's not without a rationale behind it, and we need to be willing to explain that and to make that transparent. Of course, this is fine to say, and I know this because I've talked to people who live in far more repressive regimes than Trump's United States, or or here in Norway, where you literally can't say certain things, and these rules are very different in those places. But I think that if we have the power and the freedom to say so, we must say what we mean.
Yeah, and you can't push it on the artist to have an opinion.
Exactly.
It's an institutional choice to work with.
That's right.
Specific artists. But I'm curious anyway about this. I mean, if you're talking about the museum as a democratic place, a place where democracy can take place, you would have to deal with the question of diverging
of conflict.
positions, of conflict. Yes.
Conflict, yeah.
If not agony, well, agony may be antagonistic sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think that's also part of maybe the risk you take if
That's
you
right.
also are opening up the museum for a more political position.
Yes. And I do think that, one of the things that has been very challenging in the political moment that we're having in the US, and certainly with the rise of the right all over Europe and in many other countries around the world, is the kind of profound conflict in values and politics that we're seeing. And I think that part of the reason that has been so unapproachable to address is because we don't have the spaces in which to have and hold the kinds of conflicts that need to be worked out and negotiated on a local level, right? Before we can begin to approach, national sets of national ideas and all of these kind of very much larger issues. And the space of the internet has become a platform for negotiating some of this that has become both really toxic and also very much an echo chamber. So, how do we? Part of the reason that I was interested, in making a bar space was in part because I recognized that more classical cultural institutions are not very good at creating social space. And one of the things we really need...
Tell us more about the bar.
Oh, yeah, okay. Let's talk about the bar.
You wrote a book.
Yeah.
And you opened the bar.
Yeah, and the bar happened long after I wrote the book. But it opened last fall, really. We got our liquor license last summer and really opened in the fall. And it's really a space to be together. It came out of the desire of a group of friends and co-conspirators to have a physical place to hang out, where the drinks were cheap, good, but cheap. You can get a beer for $5, which is basically unheard of in any other part of New York City. It's in the East Village of Manhattan. And, it's a low-key place to hang out. And the idea was to create a piece of cultural infrastructure that we could share, where we could have a distributed form of curatorial production where,
Because you invite artists to have residencies in the bar.
Yes, I invite artists.
They're not mixing drinks, are they?
They can if they want. With one artist, we made soup for each of her performances, so you would have free soup all night. We made 40 quarts of soup, a lot of soup. It's a lot of soup. For each, so the day before we would cook soup, and then it would be based. The soup would be selected by the special guest, and the special guest would, anyway, whatever. It was fun and complicated and great. But we've had really, really great performances, both by musicians, and the program is quite full. But the bar offers a pre-made social construction. More people know how to behave in a bar than know how to behave in a museum. And so to me, this was an interesting experiment with playing with what cultural infrastructure can do, and the kinds of cultural infrastructure that we might want to engage with if we want to try to be together again in different ways. Because I think that there's a profound alienation that we face across society. We're alienated from one another. We're alienated from ourselves even. And so to have a place that we can share, debate, have conversation, get in cahoots with one another, plot, and even just dance or have fun or sing karaoke or whatever it is. Like we need places to play, you know, as adults also, we have to play. And so, yeah, so that's what this space is designed for. So if you come to New York, come to Avenue C, come to the Francis Kite Club and hang out, you know, have a beer.
So this is maybe one directed to another, but I'm curious to know what kind of experience running a big enterprise as the Queen's Museum. What kind of knowledge do you bring with you when you run a bar?
Yeah, good question. Well, one is I would say the top thing is you know, knowing what the bar can do well and cannot do well, right? Because, you know, obviously a bar, I mean, it's a very modest bar. It has like it's an old building in New York. It has like wooden floors and brick walls and kind of weird peeling paint and whatever. It's not a space where you're going to make like a pristine painting exhibition or, you know, whatever. You're going to have other type of stuff that goes on there. But also like really weird things can happen there that can't really happen in a place like the Queen's Museum. You know, there is a certain intimacy that can take place. So I think it's back to your question of scale.
Yeah.
I think that there's something really beautiful going from a 100,000 square foot museum to going to like a 5,000, maybe it's less than that. It's like a 2,000 square foot bar. That can accommodate 125 people at a time. That change in scale is really significant. And the intimacy of that and the kind of making a space for that kind of possibility is really great. And
since it's a bar, no kids.
Actually, kids, yeah. We can have kids. We can have kids, and you can bring your children, or up till 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
There can be kids in the bar up till 10 o'clock. They just can't sit at the physical bar. They can't sit on a stool at the bar. These are the rules. I'm telling you, this is like, I know them very well because I advocated for kids. And they have to...
We love kids at the museum.
Yeah. Yeah. But they can be at the bar before 10, and also they can, but they have to be with a parent, with a guardian, or with somebody who's over 21. Let's just put it this way. It doesn't have to be a parent.
I'm just curious about what if I bring the question the other way around, what can the museum learn from a bar?
Well, that's another story altogether, and I'm not sure
you create a social space, right? That is kind of informal.
Yeah, the informality of the social space really changes the nature of discourse in a way that's really palpable, right? So there's that piece of the puzzle. You might consider having your next talk in the bar immediately rather than going to the bar after.
Yeah, well, I have experience of having a tipsy audience.
Always a good thing.
Sometimes it helps.
Yeah, always. I mean, in my experience, always a good
glass of wine, not more.
Well, depends on what kind of conversation you want to have.
Yeah.
But I also think that that having having a bar space encourages a certain kind of irreverence that I think is hard to produce in a. It's not just intimacy. There's a kind of looseness that people then might contribute their ideas in a way that doesn't feel quite as like serious or weighted by the expertise of the museum. And I think this goes back to kind of what I was saying before about exchange versus broadcast. We had this funny experience a couple of weeks ago. My friend and colleague, Chloe Bass, who's an amazing artist, she had one of her soup residencies, and there was a guy there who I thought was going to leave because he didn't realize that this conversation was taking place in a sort of this performance lecture kind of thing with the free soup and blah, blah, blah. And he was a mathematician, and he sort of piped up in the middle of the talk in the middle of the conversation when we opened it with the audience. And he made this like incredibly interesting contribution around his particular specialty in this obscure kind of mathematical field. And I was like, wow, I did not expect that. But there he was, and he's been a guy who's come by the bar before. I mean, I wouldn't say a regular, but somebody who's been to the bar before. And I thought, oh, how cool is that? I learned something about weird math, and he was super into the strange discussion we were having. And so there was sort of an unexpected participation that I think was really kind of quite rewarding.
My slightly creepy presence here is in order to try and open it up. So I just snuck along here to start inviting our audience to have some of their questions, maybe. Do you need it to percolate? There's one. We've got a mic on this side. Could you raise your hand again, please, sir? There we go.
Good to hear that Tone is still interested in bars. Tone is very well educated. She went to the Academy of Fine Art in Oslo. And to break down that institution and to get students out of their ivory towers and to begin to open up that institution, we put in a bar.
You put in a what?
A bar.
A bar.
In the middle of the whole academic, brilliant edifice. And it turned out to be quite remarkable in how this wonderful interchange of a very formal art educational institution was completely fragmented into this wonderful, wonderful social space. So, Tone, remember the good old days, and maybe something can happen here.
We do have a bar on the 13th floor, but...
Yeah, but come on, I mean a bar.
We're going up after the talk.
Yeah.
So.
All this talk of bars, I get a sense that we want to run out to the museum and run into the bar, and it's becoming this elevated space.
Yeah.
To bring it back to the museum, what is the potential of the museum? What is that space?
Well, I think that museums, I still haven't given up on the museum. I think that museums are extraordinary spaces. They're spaces that I enjoy profoundly. I think that they are spaces where we can dream, right? There are spaces where we can dream and hopefully dream more together based on the kinds of cultural experiences we have within them. I mean, I was just downstairs for only a few minutes in Denise's show. I just, being in the dream space of another artist, to be in that space of just losing yourself in a film that is, kind of embracing you on this kind of rounded screen, that is not happening at the Francis Kite Club. I can't have the experience there. So, being in that space of being immersed in another person's dream world is something that I love about cultural space that I can't reproduce in the same way that it can be created here at the MUNCH Museum, for example. I just think, I don't want to flatten all cultural experience to what happens in a bar, because I think that one of the beauties of culture and the way that it manifests in the world is that there are very many different types of institutions. So the Munch Museum may be one thing, the National Museum may be another, there may be like small grassroots cultural organizations that's doing quite something different, and they're all very valuable to me, but I also recognize the limits of what each of them can do because of their own structural limitations. So when I talk about museums in general, I always try to make the distinction to not flatten everything. So like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York is not doing things that the Whitney does, nor can it, nor should it, nor would it. Maybe it should do some things, but nonetheless. But then the Whitney is doing things that, a place like Recess or the Laundromat Project, much smaller organizations who are really leading the way in kind of reimagining how they might be structured and how they might do things to create greater equity, to make a space radically more accessible. These kinds of innovations are happening like really beautifully in very small organizations, and maybe they can't physically happen just because of the scale of the institution at a place like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or even the Whitney for that matter. So, I think that we need to be mindful of the ecology of the cultural sphere, and that it's quite diverse in its forms, even if they have very similar problems with one another. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and this is also part of the reason why for this series of talks, it's been so important for us for it to be anchored locally. So to be anchored in our ecosystem with all the different organizations that have contributed into this. So it's not like, it's called Museum Talks, but that's literally a talk at the museum.
Right.
It includes loads of other voices, including this one, Lisa Ravna.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful conversation. I think my question pertains to what you were saying about cultural infrastructure, right? Because what strikes me when you talk about that is that I was born and raised in an indigenous context where we didn't have cultural infrastructure in that way because culture sort of was a part of everything. It was all around us. It was a part of everyday life, still is. And I'm wondering if, a lot of the discourses and challenges that we experience in the museum world today, could that, can we think about this tendency to categorize everything and sort of separate everything into these small square boxes? Is that what we're dealing with? And so would then the ability to look beyond the categorization to see the world and museums as a part of that world holistically be a solution? And if so, do you have any ways of thinking about how to do that? And would you mind sharing some of them?
I will try. So, I mean, we could spend, a 6-hour seminar talking about this very subject because it's very close to my heart. And, I think there's a wonderful writer named Ariella Aisha Azoulay who's written a really powerful book called Potential History on Learning Imperialism. And she talks about the timeline and categorization as technologies of imperialism. And I think that this is something that I really, I have very strong feelings about because in many senses, even in my own life, I fall in between very many categories. And so, I'm a former museum director, I run a bar, what the heck? Nobody knows what to do with me. I'm not really an art historian, but I'm a writer, so there are a lot of us who fall in these in-between spaces that are difficult to categorize, that nobody likes to deal with because we don't, match up to expectations. And yet, those spaces can be, for me, for example, personally, some of the most productive spaces to work in because you can actually weave together something that's maybe very far different from what is expected, number one. Number two, the binaries that we're forced to contend with in general in contemporary society are completely useless to me. I find that they only force bad and reinforce bad habits and bad kind of epistemologies. And also I think that the separation of art and life has been one of the crucial problematics of our society, and how to reintegrate and to have a kind of larger understanding that sharing a meal together is an act of cultural production, that making music together is an act of cultural production, whether that's happening, in a professional venue or, around, in somebody's backyard, or that these things are not, that we should be less separated from acts of cultural production as something that's produced for us, but rather recognize the culture that we produce every single day, and that it comprises very many more things than what is captured by sort of official culture, and that's preserved within kind of museum spaces. And so while I think that there's a really important role for museums to play, that's not the end of the cultural story. And I think that for me, part of what's been rewarding about running a bar space is that it allows us to produce culture all the time and call it that, because we're saying it's a social club that's also a cultural space. And so when I talk about cultural infrastructure, what I'm talking about is, coming from a country that has no national cultural policy, it has no national ministry of culture, there is no federal funding for culture outside of a really pathetic, neurotic institution called the National Endowment for the Arts that's given a paltry amount of money to theoretically fund culture in the United States. The budget size of the National Endowment for the Arts is smaller than that of New York City's culture budget, just to give you a sense of how ridiculous it is as an entity, in part made so ridiculous because of discussions of content over what mechanisms can we fund that can hold culture. And so, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times recently with my co-founder of the Francis Kite Club, Laura Hanna, about what it would take to have a tiny, 0.5% of the US federal budget for infrastructure go to culture, and how transformative that would be in rebalancing the sources of funds for away from private individuals and corporations and philanthropy towards more public accountability. But that's a whole other conversation. But to your point, I just want to get back to I just want to get back because this is because I think that what that requires, that national level conversation about funding for culture requires, is as an understanding or just a conversation to be had on a national level about what is culture and who produces it. And to say that it is just as legitimate to fund a museum or a community center or a honky-tonk, that has line dancing or whatever, that these are all parts of our collective culture. And even if I don't know how to line dance, that doesn't mean that that's not something that should be supported as culture.
We have a question in the front here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the conversation. I'm going to be, first of all, I'd love to attend that 6-hour seminar. That would be great. Second of all, I think I'm going to revisit one of Tone's questions that I am very interested in, being an institutional nerd myself, and also being intrigued by opening a bar. Obviously, is such a nice thing to do, but it also takes a lot of hard work, as we know, as does running a museum. And I want to revisit the question of what did you bring with you from the museum directorial position into running a bar? And if you want to give an example, that's great.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, I guess, maybe it's not from being a museum director, but, kind of knowing to trust artists, having worked with many living artists over my career, knowing to sort of trust and be open to that in a way that that maybe I couldn't as much in, where I have permission to do whatever I want because it's a bar. It's not funded by somebody else. It's funded essentially by a variety of people coming in and ordering a drink. I know how to read a budget. I know how to make sure that, we're not spending too much on booze or staff or whatever, I know what that balance needs to look like. I know what it means to say, no to something when we really want it, but we kind of can't do it. Those are some of the things, the very practical parts of running a space. It's obviously, it's interesting because it's on a much smaller scale, but there's a lot I don't know about running a bar that is far outweighs the things that I bring to it from running a museum. There's a whole kind of ecology of food and beverage operations that is something that's new to me, even though my grandfather had a restaurant and my whole family has been involved in restaurants in New York for a generation. So, it must be there somehow epigenetically, but I'm not sure I really know all that much. I don't know. This question is challenging me.
Yeah, I think that's to continue the bar metaphor. We're now at last orders. We're just about, the lights are going to be flickering. Is there one final, quick, easy order not like a mojito, but like something like a shot. Does anyone have a shot that they'd like to ask either Torma or, there we go, Håkon down there, arm up. Thank you very much.
Thank you for only naming me. Thank you so much, Laura and Tone and Tominga. Thank you for your book, Laura. I really appreciated the generosity in which you referenced to thinkers and writers and artists who had informed your thinking. So commendable. I just wanted to ask, formulate as a shot. I think there's a kind of a situation in the Western museum sphere where it looks like one could make the argument that museum leaderships seem to be failing to address their publics and their staff, because we're seeing an array of open letters, you know, to the Metropolitan. So there seems to be failure, you know, even for museums, how to facilitate those conversations within themselves. And because you know, I just want to hear maybe some kind of good practice example of how you led your staff and how you've addressed how you led your public and showed your commitment to them during a moment of crisis. But I'm wondering how you would talk about,
Well, I guess I would say that, you know, I think one mistake that museums make is that they don't consider their staffs their very first publics. Like the public isn't just the public. I mean, you know, we do the work for each other, you know, and with each other as culture workers. And so the first public of the museum is everybody who works there, you know, and so that in a sense is a form of both respect and also a testing ground, right? I also think that in the space of the United States, because of the way that funding works and the way that governance works, you have boards that are comprised largely of wealthy patrons or representatives of wealthy patrons who are actually the funders of that museum. And particularly actually post-COVID, the reality is that the consolidation of wealth and power amongst those people has gotten so much greater that the common experiences that they might have between the board members, you know, just living their daily lives as who they are, and the access to the kinds of resources they have, and the increasing diversity of the staffs at the museum. It's just they live on different planets. There's like, you know, forget about, you know, in the United States, it's like they don't even send their kids to the same schools. They don't send. There's no commons that they meet on. They don't go to the same parks. They don't eat at the same restaurants. Like it's like two totally different universes. And if you can't find any common ground there, it's very challenging to, and I think that one of the biggest problems of
what you're describing is a highly divided society.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And in some senses, the director is the one who's having to negotiate this massive gap that's only gotten bigger over the last 4 years, but even before that was getting larger, right? And so how can you do that? Like it's impossible to negotiate that position.
Yeah, I would say that we are in a very lucky moment in Oslo and in Norway, as we run institutions that are more or less well funded, or at least funded by public money that is not interfering with your program.
Yeah,
and
this is
and
really
it's also an
different
amazing situation where we can actually create a network of collaborators in order to make sure that we have very many different kind of positions to speak from, not only within an institution, but also within the whole city. And I think that's crucial also in order to maintain this democratic position, whether life and art goes together or it's an object behind glass that you can hardly touch. So I think that's something that we really need to protect and to develop if we are going to continue to have this freedom as we actually do have. But I think we should also acknowledge that freedom and to make use of it. And one position that we can take also in Norway is to diversify the possibility of having a voice within the museum. At least when we become at the scale as the MUNCH, with more than 200 employees, and it's impossible to have the same view on everything. And to make that ground possible for the discussions also internally, I think it's incredibly important for also the outside of the museum.
Yeah.
And that also goes for the National Museum, of course, and the bigger institutions should take that responsibility, I think.
Yeah, and just to say that the Queen's Museum, the scale of the Queen's Museum, there were about 50 people on staff. So, we're talking about a much smaller organization than here. So, one of the things was I had a monthly staff meeting for the whole staff. And the people who were hourly were paid to come to the staff meeting so that we could at least spend 1 hour a month all together talking about one topic, whatever that was. And sometimes it was a presentation by the Queen's Teens group of, young people who were part of the, organizing their program for themselves. And sometimes it was, crying together after Trump was elected, worrying about our colleagues, and whether they were going to be deported in the next months. So, these staff meetings were really important as a place of connection. And I think like operating at a scale like that, that's almost the biggest you can be before that becomes impossible.
Well, thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Tone. And thank you, Tominga.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Please do come to the bar. You've heard the word bar so many times this evening that it's been imprinted in you. Thank you so much, Tone. Thank you so much, Laura Raicovich. See you in the bar.